psychology professor who was giving students a test. He asked a question concerning manic depression. The question read, what would you call someone who walks back and forth screaming at the top of his lungs 1 minute and then sits in a chair and weeps uncontrollably the next minute? One of the students answered, a basketball coach. Did you see that news story this week? Jerry Tarkanian from Las Vegas, Nevada, he passed away, and he was known for walking around the sidelines with a towel, and he would walk around and chew this towel as he paced back and forth across the sidelines. Someone would miss a shot, he'd say, get your head up, keep playing, keep going. He would offer this encouragement, but then the next thing you know, he'd go right back to that towel. Extraordinary stress, of course, isn't reserved just for basketball coaches. It's also for all of us ordinary people. And Paul writes for us today, do not lose heart. Though your outer nature is wasting away, your inner nature is being renewed day by day. And what he means by that is the outer nature that's wasting away, life is going to take its toll on you, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And Paul knew that. He had hardships. He knew what they could do to us. And people talk about stress management. They say to me, Andrew, are you managing your stress? And I say, I don't want to manage stress. I'm not interested in managing stress. I'm interested in stress demolition, stress eradication. I don't want to manage it. I want to live without it. But it's really hard to avoid stress. We can't. We have to face it. And it can kill you. It can kill your body. It can kill your relationships. It can kill your spirit. I was watching a special about stress on the National Geographic Channel. They were talking about dopamine levels in your brain. And it said that, the bottom line of the study said that when you're stressed, food doesn't taste as good, the sun doesn't shine as bright, the air doesn't smell as fresh, music doesn't sound as good, jokes don't sound as funny. Basically, everything in life is brought down. And most of the time, we're stressed about things we can't even control. Thomas Kepler gathered together 104 psychologists, and he determined after talking to them a certain timetable about anxiety. At 18, we worry about ideals. At 20 years old, we worry about appearance. At 23, our main worry is about morals. At 26, we're worried about making a good impression. At 30 years old, we're worried about salary and the cost of living. 31, we're worried about business success. At 33, we're worried about job security. At 41, we start getting worried about loss of ambition. And then from 45 on, you worry about your health more than anything else. The sad part is, we add to these concerns by the anxiety that we bring to them along the way. Someone said, worry's like a rocking chair. It can give you something to do, but it gets you nowhere. Paul says 2 times in this reading, don't lose heart. Why? Though life takes its toll, Paul said the inner person can be strengthened. How is that possible? When stress is pressing against us, first of all, you've got to believe that God holds the future. You've got to believe what Paul said. It's a slight momentary affliction that's preparing you for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Paul said, look to the things not that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. He had a hope in the future that all the fiery trials he went through could not consume. Remember when Winston Churchill was asked, what's the greatest weapon that your country possesses against the Nazi regime fighting Hitler? Without even pausing, Winston Churchill said, it's always been England's best weapon, hope. Now, if you contrast that to Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, he talked about men who walked around, convicts, that he called goners. They gave up hope. And you could notice them because they were dead on their feet. They would walk around with their heads down, and they would stare kind of vacantly. It was all over for them because they had given up. Evidence is accumulating. You can't live without hope. Doctors know that as soon as they tell you that you're terminal, it's kind of like a death sentence starts right then, because once you start to lose hope, the deterioration becomes very rapid. Paul looks to things that are unseen, that are still anticipated. And hope builds in the heart. You have to believe in God and that God holds the future. That's the first step to keep from losing heart. That's how you strengthen the inner person and keep the outer person from wasting away. Believe that God holds the future. You've got to believe that because it's true. Mark Twain was once taking a train trip, and he was taking his briefcase with him, and he went up to the baggage handler that was putting the bags in, and he said to him, do you think this briefcase can make it on the trip? And he shrugged and kind of looked at the case, and he took the case, he hurled it to the pavement and said, that, sir, is what the case will get in Philadelphia. And he walked over to it and picked it up. And then he hit it about 5 or 6 times against the train car and said, this is what it's going to get in Chicago. Finally, he threw the case up in the air, fell to the ground, and he started jumping up and down on it. The papers and books started spilling out, and he said, this is what it's going to get in Sioux City. And Mark Twain was watching in disbelief. The man picks up the briefcase, hands it back to him, and says, if you're going farther than Sioux City, I suggest that you carry this yourself. You ever felt like you're Mark Twain's briefcase? Paul certainly did. Yet he became so upbeat. He said, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Without any self-pity, Paul takes it as a matter of course that the first step is to believe that God holds the future. The second step is focus on the task at hand. Do something that you need to do. Wise people don't let go of the things that need to be done in the present because of things in the past pressing on them. You've got to do the things that need to be done today. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 6:24? Do not be anxious about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. There was a man who was at real peace with his life. And he went to visit a minister, and he had a basket of fresh fruit. And he gave it to the minister. And the minister said, how are you so calm in your life? I can see that you're so calm. He said, well, I learned. When I shut the door, I shut the door. He said, it used to be when I went to bed, I would take all my troubles and fears with me, and I would take them all with me to bed. I have a lot of trouble getting to sleep. He said, one night I went to the window. It was a beautiful night. And then there was a bright moon. And I could see the light flooding the meadow. He said, that perfect tranquility mocked the surging tumult of my brain. Why had I locked the office door so carefully when all the ledgers and cash books followed me right on out to my bed? Why did I close the bedroom door when all the cares of life follow me right in to bed with me? He said, at that moment I knelt down and I said, oh God, forgive me for bringing this baggage into bed. Release me. Help me shut the door. And he said, since then, every time I shut the door, I shut the door. And that's good advice for all of us. R.G. Letourneau once said, worry and trust can't live in the same house because as soon as trust walks in, worry walks out the other door. And then if trust leaves, worry comes right back in. How true it is. It's like that construction crew that was building a new road. They were knocking down trees. And the superintendent noticed one tree had this nest in it. And they were all looking at it. And they said, let's leave that tree. Let's keep working, but we'll leave that tree because the nest has the little eggs in it. So a few weeks later, they got in the bucket. They went up. And the little fledglings were gone. They had learned to fly. And so they allowed the tree to be cut down. The tree crashed to the ground. The nest burst. And all the materials that had been used to make the nest scattered on the ground, and there were some scraps here and there. And there was a little piece of paper that had come from a Sunday school lesson book. And on that piece of paper were the words, "He cares for you." And he held it up, and they all gathered around. He cares for you. It was a message from God for those construction workers. Just as He cares for the sparrow, He cares for you. There's no valley too dark that He can't walk with you. Even as life takes its toll on your outer person, your inner person can be made strong because God holds the future, because you're going to focus on the task at hand. You've got to know that He cares for you. And the final point is, let God's light shine through. Let it shine through no matter what happens in your life. You can find a way to let God's light shine through no matter what happens. One time there was a cowboy who went to talk to an insurance agent, and the agent said to him, he said, I see your ranch. You're very busy. I want to ask you some questions. Have you had any accidents? And he said, no. He said, no accidents? He said, no. He said, you're saying you weren't hurt at all just this week? And he said, well, yeah, yesterday a bronco kicked me in the ribs and a snake bit me. A rattlesnake bit me on the ankle. And the agent said, well, wouldn't you call those accidents? And he answered in all seriousness, oh no, they did it on purpose. You see, life does terrible things to some people, harsh things to each and every one of us. And somewhere along the way, you've got to learn how to deal with those things. You've got to learn how to deal with the bronco. You've got to learn how to deal with the detours. You've got to learn how to deal with the snake bite. When you're shipwrecked or imprisoned or in chains like Paul, your life has to be a testimony to the truth that you can be victors rather than victims. And what's the secret? Paul tells us. He knew the transcendent power of God in his own life. He knew how Christ lived in him. And he knew that nothing on the outside was strong enough to crush it. And by faith in Jesus Christ, Paul said, by faith you can conquer. Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen tells about a 24-year-old man. He had to have a leg amputated to stop the spread of bone cancer, and he was so angry and bitter for a long time, he couldn't see anything past that disability. But eventually, through various therapies, mainly art therapy, he was able to confront his emotions. So much so that she used him to visit other people in the hospital. And other patients began to see him as a symbol of hope. And they were dealing with their emotions the way that he dealt with them. One day, this young man visited a woman who had just been operated on for breast cancer, and she was at the lowest of the low. She was in a deep depression. He walked in her room. There was just a little bit of music from a radio by her bed. He tried to talk to her. He couldn't get through. Suddenly, he took off his artificial leg and started dancing around the room on one leg. And she looked at him and started laughing and said, if you can dance, then I can sing. And she did. That was the kind of influence that he had. And then later, he sat down with a doctor and he was talking about his therapy, and they were looking at some of the artwork that he had done and how his views of life had changed, how his perspective had changed. And all these pictures express so beautifully the things he had felt in his life. And at one point, he was asked to draw a picture of his body, and he drew this vase. Remember what Paul said? We are treasures in clay jars. Well, this picture of a vase that he drew had a big crack in it that symbolized the bitterness and disgust. And he said, this crack was my life, broken, useless, no longer able to be used. But after I learned, I got this crayon and I drew bright yellow streamers coming out. She said, what's that? He said, that is where it's broken, the light comes through. This young man had reframed his whole experience. This is where the light comes through, where he saw once only darkness. Now he saw light. There was once darkness in Paul's heart, remember? On that Damascus road, the light shined through, and it was the light of Christ. He became a changed person. He had a new perspective on life, and that perspective helped him the whole way to see how Christ was working in his life, regardless of what needed to be overcome. That's the kind of light that needs to shine in your heart and mind. I want to summarize this message. If you're stressed out and you're chewing the towel, keep your head up. Your greatest weapon is hope. You may feel like you're being tossed around by an old briefcase, like an old briefcase on your journey of life. But just shut the door on that. Put the worry out and let the trust in, and know that God cares for you. He's sending you a little message today. It comes down from up high. And it says you can handle being bucked off a bronco. You can handle snake bite, because in those disabilities, God's light's going to shine through. That's what the gospel's all about. Taking that which seems hopeless and making it hopeful. Taking that which is defeated and making it victorious. That's what the cross is all about. It's a symbol of shame that's transformed into a means of salvation, a badge of triumph. Remember, believe, God holds the future, focus on the task at hand, know that God cares for you, let your light shine. Amen.